The great hall of Ashford Palace had never felt so hollow as it did during the emergency council meeting that afternoon. Alexander sat at the head of the ancient oak table, where his ancestors had made decisions that shaped the kingdom for generations. Today he would make one that would end his family's rule over the land they had protected for centuries. Lord Chancellor Matthews, a man who had served Alexander's father and grandfather before him, cleared his throat nervously. His usually perfect composure was cracked, revealing the emotion beneath. "Your Majesty, the Parliament of Valdoria has formally requested your immediate ascension to their throne. The neighboring kingdoms are already positioning troops near their borders, claiming they want to provide assistance during this difficult time." Alexander knew what assistance meant in diplomatic terms. Invasion, conquest. The vultures were already circling the wounded nation of Valdoria, and only his presence there could keep them at bay. The ancient treaty wasn't just about honor anymore. It was about survival for millions of people who had just lost everything. "What about Ashford?" asked Duke Harrison, Alexander's oldest friend and most trusted advisor. "Who will rule here when you leave? Your brother Prince Edward is traveling in the distant colonies and won't return for months." The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Alexander had spent sleepless hours considering this very problem. Ashford needed strong leadership, but Valdoria needed him more urgently. It was an impossible choice between two loves, two duties, two peoples who depended on him. "My cousin Prince William has agreed to serve as regent until Edward returns," Alexander announced. "He's proven himself capable during his governorship of the northern provinces, and the Parliament here has already approved the arrangement." But Alexander's voice lacked its usual conviction. Prince William was competent and honorable, but he wasn't Alexander. The people of Ashford had known their crown prince since birth, had watched him grow from a mischievous boy into a wise leader. They trusted him in ways that couldn't be transferred overnight to another man, no matter how qualified. Meanwhile, in the children's wing of the palace, Princess Catherine sat on the floor of the nursery with James and Emma, trying to find words that would make sense of the impossible. The twins had been unusually quiet since being summoned from their afternoon lessons, sensing the heaviness that had settled over the palace like a storm cloud. "Mama, why does everyone look so sad?" Emma asked, her bright blue eyes reflecting a wisdom beyond her 10 years. She had always been the more perceptive of the twins, able to read emotions in the way adults sometimes forgot children could. Catherine pulled both children closer, breathing in the familiar scent of their hair, trying to memorize this moment before everything changed. "Do you remember Uncle Ferdinand and Aunt Isabella from Valdoria? And their children, Marcus and Sophia?" James nodded eagerly. "They came for my birthday last year. Marcus taught me how to sail the model boat in the pond. Is he coming to visit again?" The innocent hope in her son's voice nearly broke Catherine's carefully maintained composure. "No, my darling. There was an accident and they've gone to heaven. All of them." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's hand found her mother's, squeezing tight with a strength that seemed impossible for such small fingers. James stared at the floor, processing the news with the serious expression he wore when trying to solve difficult mathematics problems. "That's very sad," Emma said finally. "They were nice to us. Who will take care of their kingdom now?" "We will," Catherine said gently. "Papa and I have to go to Valdoria to help their people, and you two will come with us. We're going to live there now." "Forever?" James asked, and the single word carried the weight of a child's entire world. "Yes, sweetheart, forever." Emma was quiet for a long moment, then asked the question Catherine had been dreading. "What about Ashford? What about our home?" Catherine had no easy answer. "How do you explain to children that sometimes duty requires sacrificing everything you love? How do you tell them that being royal means your heart belongs not just to your family, but to people you've never met who need your help?" "Ashford will always be our home in here," Catherine said, placing her hand over Emma's heart. "But sometimes we have to help others, even when it's very hard for us. The people of Valdoria are scared and sad, just like you would be if something happened to Papa and me. They need us to come and help them feel safe again." That evening, as Catherine walked through the palace gardens one last time before dinner, she found Alexander sitting on their favorite bench beside the rose garden he had planted for her on their first wedding anniversary. The setting sun painted everything in golden light, making the familiar seem precious and dreamlike. "The children took it better than I expected," she said, settling beside him on the worn stone bench where they had shared countless conversations over the years. "They're stronger than we give them credit for," Alexander replied, but his voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Sometimes I think they understand duty better than we do. They see it simply. People need help, so we help them. They don't complicate it with all the fear and regret that we carry." Catherine reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers the way they had done thousands of times before. "Are we doing the right thing? Leaving everything we know? Taking our children away from their home?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted, and the honesty in his voice was both refreshing and terrifying. "I know we don't have a choice. The treaty binds us, honor demands it, and those people need us, but knowing something is right doesn't make it hurt less." They sat in silence as the last light faded from the garden, both thinking about all the goodbyes still to come. Tomorrow they would begin the heartbreaking process of saying farewell to everyone and everything that had shaped their lives. Palace staff who had become family, traditions that stretched back generations, and a land that held their deepest roots would all become memories. But tonight, for just a few more hours, they were still home. The following days passed in a blur of preparation and painful farewells. Catherine found herself moving through the palace like a ghost, touching familiar objects as if she could somehow take their essence with her to Valdoria. Each room seemed to whisper memories of happier times, making the simple act of packing feel like dismantling her own soul piece by piece. In the royal apartments, Catherine stood before her jewelry box, holding the delicate pearl necklace Alexander had given her on their engagement. It had belonged to his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and represented generations of Ashford royalty. She was carefully wrapping it in silk when Emma appeared in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed elephant. "Mama, can I take Mr. Peanuts with me?" Emma asked, holding up the worn gray elephant that had been her constant companion since she was 3 years old. "Will there be elephants in Valdoria?" "Of course you can take Mr. Peanuts." Catherine smiled through her tears. "And I don't think there are elephants in Valdoria, but there are beautiful horses and maybe some friendly sheep." Emma nodded solemnly, then surprised her mother by asking, "Will the sad people there like us? What if they don't want us because we're not their real family?" The wisdom in her daughter's question took Catherine's breath away. Emma had somehow understood what the adults had been dancing around for days. The people of Valdoria would be getting strangers as their new royal family, foreigners who spoke with different accents and knew nothing of their customs or traditions. "They might not like us at first," Catherine said honestly, sitting on the bed and pulling Emma close. "They're grieving for Uncle Ferdinand's family, and we can never replace them. But we can love them and work hard to earn their trust. Sometimes love grows slowly, like the roses in our garden." Meanwhile, Alexander was in his study with James, teaching his son about the maps and documents that detailed Valdoria's geography and government. James studied everything with the intensity he usually reserved for his favorite adventure books, asking questions that showed he was beginning to understand the magnitude of their new responsibility. "Papa, why couldn't Uncle Ferdinand's parliament just choose a new king from their own people?" James asked, tracing his finger along the Valdorian coastline on the large map spread across the desk. "Because their constitution was written differently than ours," Alexander explained. "They believed that having royal blood from a friendly kingdom would prevent wars and keep peace. It seemed like a good idea when the treaty was signed, but no one imagined a tragedy like this." James was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been haunting Alexander. "Do you think Grandpapa would be proud of us for going? Or disappointed that we're leaving Ashford?" Alexander's father, the late King George, had devoted his entire life to Ashford and its people. He had taught Alexander that a king's first duty was always to his own kingdom, but he had also raised him to honor treaties and help those in need. The contradiction felt like being pulled apart by two horses running in opposite directions. "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that Grandpapa would be proud that we're keeping our word, even when it costs us everything we love. That's what honor means, James. It's easy to keep promises when they don't hurt." The hardest farewell came when they visited Alexander's elderly grandmother, Queen Mother Elizabeth, in her private apartments in the west wing of the palace. At 87 years old, she was too frail to make the journey to Valdoria, and everyone knew this goodbye would be forever. "My dear boy," she said, taking Alexander's hands in her paper-thin fingers, You're doing what your grandfather would have done, and his grandfather before him. The crown is not a decoration. It's a burden we carry for others. But when she hugged Catherine and the children, the strong facade cracked and tears she had been holding back for days finally fell. "I never thought I would outlive my great-grandchildren's childhood," she whispered. "I always imagined watching them grow up in these halls, teaching Emma about the royal jewels and showing James the secret passages." Catherine's heart broke not just for their own loss, but for this remarkable woman who would spend her final years alone, surrounded by empty rooms that had once echoed with family laughter. "We'll write every week," Catherine promised. "And we'll tell them stories about Ashford so they never forget where they came from." That night, the palace staff gathered in the Great Hall for a farewell ceremony that hadn't been held in over 300 years. The last time an Ashford royal had left the kingdom permanently was when Princess Margaret married a foreign prince in 1698. Cook Mrs. Henderson, who had worked in the palace kitchens for 40 years, wept openly as she presented Catherine with a small cookbook containing all the children's favorite recipes so they can have a taste of home wherever they are, she explained through her tears. "Master, of horse Thomas Wright gave James a small wooden carving of Thunder, the boy's favorite stallion. So you remember your first riding lessons," he said gruffly, clearly fighting his own emotions. Head gardener Peter Collins handed Emma a small potted rose cutting from the royal garden. "Plant this in Valdoria, Your Highness. Maybe a piece of Ashford can grow there too." But perhaps the most touching gift came from Margaret, Catherine's lady-in-waiting and closest friend. She pressed a thick leather-bound book into Catherine's hands. "I've been writing down everything," Margaret explained. "Every funny thing the children said, every quiet moment you and Alexander shared, every ordinary day that felt special. I thought you might want to remember." As Catherine opened the book and saw pages filled with Margaret's careful handwriting documenting their daily life, she realized that this was more precious than any jewel or treasure. These were their memories made tangible, their history preserved in ink and paper. The ceremony ended with ancient words that hadn't been spoken in the Great Hall for generations. "May the road rise to meet you, may the wind be at your back, and may you find peace in the service of others, even when that service leads you far from home." As the crowd dispersed and the family made their way back to their apartments for one final night in the palace, Alexander paused at the foot of the grand staircase. Every step he had climbed thousands of times, every portrait of his ancestors watching from the walls, every familiar sound and scent would soon be nothing but memory. "Tomorrow we begin again," he said quietly to Catherine as they reached their bedroom door. "Together," she replied, and in that single word lay all the strength they would need for the impossible journey ahead. The morning of departure dawned gray and misty, as if the sky itself was mourning their leaving. Catherine woke before sunrise, unable to sleep, and found herself wandering through the silent palace one last time. Her footsteps echoed differently in the empty corridors, where packed trunks and covered furniture created ghostly shapes in the dim light. She paused at the nursery where both children had taken their first steps, then moved to the music room where she and Alexander had danced to their wedding song on quiet evenings. Each room held a lifetime of moments that would now exist only in her heart. She tried to memorize the way the morning light fell through the tall windows, the exact shade of blue in the silk wallpaper, the feeling of being truly home. Alexander found her in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, where they had been married 12 years ago. The same altar where his parents had wed and their parents before them, stretching back through centuries of family history. Now that chain was broken and the sacred space would stand empty of royal ceremonies for the first time in over 400 years. "Regrets?" he asked softly, settling beside her on the worn velvet kneeling cushion. "1,000 of them," Catherine admitted, "but not about our choice. About time. About all the ordinary moments I didn't appreciate because I thought we'd have forever." They prayed together in the silence, not for strength or courage, but for the people they were leaving behind and the people they would soon serve. When they finally stood to leave, Catherine placed her wedding bouquet, carefully preserved all these years, on the altar as an offering of gratitude for the happiness they had known within these walls. The children were unusually quiet during breakfast, picking at their favorite foods the cook had prepared one final time. James methodically ate his way around his plate, saving the best bits for last as he always did, while Emma built small towers with her toast pieces, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few days. "Are you ready for an adventure?" Alexander asked them, trying to inject some enthusiasm into his voice. "I suppose," James replied with the diplomatic caution he'd inherited from his father. "Will there be children our age in Valdoria? Will we have to learn a new language?" Uncle Ferdinand's children spoke both languages, Catherine reassured him. "And yes, there will be children there. In fact, there are several noble families with children close to your age who I'm sure will be eager to meet you." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Catherine worried about how different everything would be. The twins had grown up surrounded by people who had known them since birth, in a land where every tradition and custom felt as natural as breathing. Now they would be foreign princes in a grieving country, expected to represent hope and continuity while learning to navigate an entirely new world. The journey to the harbor was lined with thousands of people from the kingdom who had come to say goodbye. Catherine had expected crowds, but the sheer number of citizens who had made the trip to see them off was overwhelming. Entire families stood in the morning drizzle, many holding handmade signs with messages of love and support. "Come back to us," called out an elderly woman near the palace gates, and the cry was taken up by others in the crowd. "Come back when you can." Alexander rode with the carriage windows open despite the rain, wanting to see and acknowledge every person who had come to wish them well. Some reached out to touch the carriage as it passed, as if trying to hold on to their departing royal family for just a moment longer. Children threw flower petals that stuck to the wet carriage sides like colorful tears. Young Emma pressed her face to the window, waving at the crowds with the innocent joy that had always made her beloved by the people. But Catherine noticed that her daughter's other hand was clutched tightly around Mr. Peanuts, the familiar elephant providing comfort in this sea of unfamiliar faces. At the harbor, the royal ship Ashford's Pride waited with black flags flying at half-mast in honor of the Valdorian royal family. The vessel had been hastily prepared for the journey, its usual bright blue and gold decorations replaced with the somber colors appropriate for their mission of grief and duty. Captain Morris, who had served the royal family for 20 years, stood at attention as they boarded. His weathered face showed the strain of the past week, knowing this voyage would end his long service to Ashford's crown. "We'll have fair winds, your majesties," he reported with professional composure, though his voice wavered slightly. "The crossing should take 4 days if the weather holds. 4 days to say goodbye to everything they could see from Ashford's shores. 4 days to prepare themselves mentally for taking on the grief and expectations of an entire nation. 4 days to transform from beloved rulers of a peaceful kingdom into caretakers of a national tragedy." As the ship pulled away from the harbor, Alexander and Catherine stood at the stern rail with their children, watching their homeland grow smaller with each passing moment. The palace was visible on its hill for nearly an hour, its familiar towers and flags becoming tiny dots before finally disappearing behind the coastal cliffs. "Will we remember what it looked like?" Emma asked, her small hand gripping the ship's rail. "We'll remember," Catherine promised, though she wondered if memory would be enough to sustain them through the difficult years ahead. That first night at sea, Catherine found Alexander on deck long after the children had fallen asleep in their cabin. He stood alone at the bow, staring ahead toward Valdoria, rather than back toward the home they had left. The moonlight on the water created a silver path leading toward their unknown future. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, wrapping her cloak around both of them against the sea wind. "Responsibility," Alexander said quietly. "We're not just changing our own lives anymore. Every decision we make in Valdoria will affect millions of people who didn't choose us, who might not want us, who are already suffering. What if we fail them? Then we'll fail together," Catherine replied with simple certainty. "And we'll get up and try again the next day, and the day after that until we learn how to succeed. That's what Ferdinand and Isabella would have done. That's what our parents taught us to do." As they stood together on the deck of the ship carrying them toward their destiny, neither of them knew that their arrival in Valdoria would be met by crowds even larger than those who had bid them farewell. Neither could imagine that their first sight of their new kingdom would be thousands of grieving citizens, holding candles in the darkness, waiting for the foreign royals who represented their only hope for peace and stability. They had left Ashford as beloved rulers saying goodbye to their people. They would arrive in Valdoria as strangers tasked with healing a nation's broken heart. while learning to live with their own. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ashford Palace, as Crown Prince Alexander stood at the grand window of his private study. His hands trembled slightly as he held the letter that would change everything. The royal seal of the neighboring kingdom of Valdoria bore news that made his heart sink deeper with each word he read. Princess Catherine, his beloved wife of 12 years, sat quietly in her favorite armchair, her delicate fingers wrapped around a cup of tea that had long grown cold. She watched her husband's face change from confusion to disbelief, then to a pain so deep it seemed to cut through the very air between them. The silence in the room was broken only by the distant sound of their twin children playing in the palace gardens below. "What is it, my love?" Catherine's voice was soft, but Alexander could hear the worry threading through her words. She had learned to read his expressions over their years together, and she knew that whatever news the letter contained would alter their world forever. Alexander turned from the window, his usually strong shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. The letter crumpled slightly in his grip as he struggled to find the words. How does one tell the person they love most in the world that everything they had built together was about to crumble? How does a man who had always been taught to be strong show his greatest weakness? "It's from King Ferdinand of Valdoria," Alexander began, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's been a terrible accident. The entire royal family—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The words felt like stones in his throat. Catherine set down her teacup with shaking hands. She had met the Valdorian royal family many times over the years. Queen Isabella had become like a sister to her, and their children often played together during state visits. The thought of something happening to them made her stomach twist with dread. "Are they—" Catherine couldn't bring herself to say the word either. Alexander nodded slowly, his eyes filling with tears he had been holding back since he first read the devastating news. All of them. A sailing accident during their family holiday. The storms came so suddenly that the rescue teams couldn't reach them in time. The teacup slipped from Catherine's nerveless fingers, shattering against the polished floor. The sound seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot. And suddenly the reality of what this meant began to settle over them both like a heavy blanket. Valdoria and Ashford had been bound by more than just friendship and political alliance. They were connected by an ancient treaty, one that had kept peace between their kingdoms for over 2 centuries. The treaty stated clearly that if either royal line should end without a direct heir, the surviving kingdom would absorb the other, but only if a member of the surviving royal family agreed to rule both lands. Alexander would have to leave everything he had ever known. He would have to leave Ashford, leave his homeland, and take his family to rule a grieving nation that had just lost everything they held dear. The weight of 2 kingdoms would rest on his shoulders, and the price of that responsibility was higher than he had ever imagined. "We have to go, don't we?" Catherine's voice was steady now, but Alexander could see the tears beginning to form in her beautiful green eyes. "We have to leave Ashford and go to Valdoria." "Yes," Alexander said simply. "The council has already been notified. King Ferdinand's final wish, written in his own hand before the voyage, was that our family should take the throne if anything happened to his line. He trusted us to care for his people as if they were our own." Catherine stood slowly and walked to where her husband stood. She reached up to touch his face, her thumb gently wiping away a tear that had escaped despite his efforts to remain strong. "Then we'll go," she said firmly. "We'll go because it's our duty, and because Ferdinand and Isabella would have done the same for us." But even as she spoke the words, Catherine felt her heart breaking. Ashford was not just their home. It was where they had fallen in love, where their children had taken their first steps, where every room held a memory that had shaped their family. The gardens below held the laughter of countless afternoons. The library contained books they had read together by firelight, and the chapel had witnessed their wedding vows. Their children, Prince James and Princess Emma, both 10 years old, would have to leave their friends, their tutors, their ponies, and everything familiar. They would have to grow up in a foreign land, learning new customs and languages while helping their parents heal a nation's broken heart. "How long do we have?" Catherine asked, though she already suspected the answer would be far too short. 3 weeks, Alexander replied. "The Valdorian parliament is barely holding the country together. There are already whispers of neighboring kingdoms considering invasion, thinking Valdoria is vulnerable without a royal family. We need to get there quickly to show strength and stability. 3 weeks to say goodbye to everything they loved." 3 weeks to pack up a lifetime of memories. 3 weeks to prepare their children for a future none of them had ever imagined. As Catherine looked around the study that had been her sanctuary for so many years, she wondered if 3 weeks would be enough time to break their own hearts properly, or if the pain would follow them across the sea to their new kingdom, a constant reminder of everything they had left behind. The Valdorian coastline appeared through the morning mist on their 4th day at sea, revealing a landscape that was both beautiful and foreign. Where Ashford's shores were marked by gentle rolling hills and familiar green meadows, Valdoria rose from the water in dramatic cliffs topped with ancient forests. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that this land held a different character entirely, shaped by different storms and different stories. As Ashford's pride sailed into Valdoria's main harbor, the sight that greeted them took their breath away. Thousands upon thousands of people lined the waterfront, dressed in the traditional black of mourning but carrying small lanterns that flickered like earthbound stars in the gray morning light. The silence was absolute and overwhelming, broken only by the sound of waves against the harbor walls and the distant tolling of church bells. "There are so many of them," James whispered, pressing close to his father at the ship's rail. The boy had been excited about seeing a new kingdom, but the reality of their reception sobered him quickly. These weren't the cheerful crowds of Ashford who had come to celebrate and wish them well. These were people in the depths of grief, looking to strangers for salvation they weren't sure could be provided. Captain Morris approached with news that made Alexander's stomach tighten with anxiety. "Your Majesty, the Valdorian Prime Minister requests that you disembark immediately for the coronation ceremony. Parliament is concerned about the political situation and wants to establish your authority as quickly as possible." Catherine felt her heart sink. She had hoped for time to meet their new people gradually, to learn about their customs and grief before taking on the full weight of rulership. But the realities of politics and international pressure meant there would be no gentle transition, no period of adjustment. They would step off this ship as guests and be crowned rulers within hours. As their family prepared to leave the ship, Catherine noticed that Emma had been unusually quiet since the coastline came into view. When she knelt to adjust her daughter's formal dress, she saw tears in the little girl's eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Catherine asked gently. "They look so sad, Mama," Emma whispered. "What if we can't make them happy? What if they always miss their old king and queen more than they could ever like us?" The question pierced Catherine's heart because it echoed her own deepest fears. How do you follow beloved rulers who died tragically? How do you earn love from people who are still grieving the family they lost? She pulled Emma close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, trying to find words that would comfort both of them. "We don't need to make them happy right away," Catherine said finally. "We just need to help them feel safe and cared for. Happiness will come later when their hearts are ready for it. Our job is to be patient and kind while they learn to trust us." The procession from the harbor to the royal palace wound through streets lined with more people than Catherine had ever seen in one place. But unlike the enthusiastic crowds of Ashford, these citizens watched them pass with careful, evaluating eyes. Some bowed respectfully, others simply stared, and a few turned away entirely, their grief too fresh to acknowledge the foreign family who would now rule them. The Valdorian palace was magnificent but alien, built from dark stone that reflected the mountainous landscape rather than Ashford's warm limestone. Ancient tapestries depicted battles and ceremonies Catherine didn't recognize, while portraits of the fallen royal family watched from every wall with eyes that seemed to question whether these newcomers were worthy of the crown they were about to inherit. Prime Minister Rodriguez, a stern man in his 60s who had served the late King Ferdinand for 20 years, met them in the grand entrance hall. His bow was correct but cool, and Catherine sensed immediately that earning his respect would be a long and difficult process. "Your Majesties," he said formally, "the coronation ceremony has been prepared according to traditional Valdorian custom. The crown jewels are ready and Parliament is assembled. However, I must inform you that several neighboring kingdoms have requested audiences immediately following the ceremony. The political situation remains delicate." Alexander straightened his shoulders, drawing on every lesson his father had taught him about projecting strength even when feeling uncertain. "We understand the urgency, Prime Minister. We're ready to serve Valdoria with everything we have." The coronation ceremony took place in the ancient cathedral, where Valdorian royalty had been crowned for over 6 centuries. The building was packed with nobles, dignitaries, and representatives from across the kingdom, but the atmosphere was nothing like the joyful celebrations Catherine remembered from their own wedding. Instead, the air was heavy with solemnity and watchful uncertainty. As the Archbishop of Valdoria placed the ancient crown on Alexander's head, Catherine couldn't help but think about the last man who had worn it. King Ferdinand had been crowned in this same spot 30 years ago, young and hopeful and surrounded by family who believed they would rule together for decades. Now those same crown jewels rested on the head of a foreign prince who had never imagined he would wear them. When her own coronation moment came, Catherine felt the weight of Queen Isabella's crown settling on her head, like a physical manifestation of responsibility. The jewels had been resized hastily to fit her, but they still felt foreign against her temples. As she looked out at the sea of unfamiliar faces in the cathedral, she wondered if she would ever feel like she truly belonged to this crown, or if she would always be an outsider, playing a role that belonged to someone else. The children were given smaller ceremonial coronets, marking them as heirs to the Valdorian throne. Emma bore the ceremony with remarkable dignity for a 10-year-old, standing perfectly still even when the heavy gold circle was placed on her head. But James looked overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, his young face serious as he tried to process becoming a prince of a kingdom he had only learned about a week ago. After the ceremony, the new royal family was presented to the people from the palace balcony. The crowd below was massive, filling the square and stretching into the surrounding streets as far as the eye could see. When Alexander stepped forward to address his new subjects for the first time, the silence was so complete that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat. "People of Valdoria," Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp air, "we stand before you today not as conquerors or strangers, but as servants. We know that no one can replace the royal family you have lost, and we would never try. Instead, we offer ourselves as caretakers of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella's legacy, as guardians of the kingdom they loved so deeply." A murmur ran through the crowd, the first sound they had made since the royal family appeared on the balcony. Catherine couldn't tell if it was approval or skepticism, but at least it was a reaction. "We come to you from Ashford with heavy hearts, but willing hands," Alexander continued. "We will learn your customs, honor your traditions, and work every day to earn the trust you gave so freely to those who came before us. We ask for your patience as we become the rulers you need us to be." When the speech ended, the applause was polite but restrained. This was not the beginning of a love story between rulers and subjects, but rather the start of a long courtship that might or might not end in mutual acceptance. As they waved to the crowd below, Catherine realized that their real work was just beginning. That night, as they settled into their new home for the first time, the palace felt impossibly large and empty around them. Every room echoed with the absence of the family who should have been there, while the weight of an entire kingdom's expectations pressed down on their shoulders like a blanket made of lead. 6 months after their arrival in Valdoria, Catherine stood in the same palace garden where Queen Isabella had once grown her famous roses, watching her children play with a group of young Valdorian nobles. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of joy and melancholy that had become familiar since leaving Ashford. Emma had adapted to their new life with remarkable resilience, quickly learning enough Valdorian to communicate with the palace staff and making friends with the children of visiting diplomats. She had even convinced the head gardener to help her plant the rose cutting from Ashford, which had somehow survived the journey and was now sending out tiny green shoots in the foreign soil. James, meanwhile, had thrown himself into learning everything he could about Valdorian history and law, spending hours in the palace library with ancient texts that detailed the kingdom's traditions. His tutors reported that he asked intelligent questions about the differences between Ashford and Valdorian customs, already thinking like a future king who would need to bridge two different worlds. Alexander emerged from the palace with a stack of letters in his hand, his expression showing the weight of the constant decisions and diplomacy that filled his days. The threatening postures of neighboring kingdoms had subsided once his rule was established, but governing Valdoria required learning an entirely new set of political relationships and economic challenges. "Letters from home?" Catherine asked, though she could tell from his face that at least some of the correspondence brought difficult news. "Prince William writes that the harvest in Ashford was excellent this year," Alexander said. settling beside her on the stone bench that had become their favorite spot for private conversations. But grandmother is growing weaker. The doctor doesn't think she'll see another winter. Catherine's heart clenched at the thought of Queen Mother Elizabeth facing her final days without family nearby. The guilt of their absence was a constant ache that never quite healed, made worse by the knowledge that their duty to Valdoria meant they couldn't return even for the most important family moments. "We could send the children for a visit," Catherine suggested, though they had discussed this possibility many times without finding a solution, just for a few weeks to say goodbye. "The Valdorian Parliament would see it as abandonment," Alexander replied with the weary tone of a man who had explored every option. "We're still too new here, still too fragile in their trust. Any sign that our hearts remain in Ashford could undermine everything we've built." It was the cruel irony of their position. To serve Valdoria properly, they had to prove their complete commitment to their new kingdom, even at the cost of their connections to the home they still loved. Every letter from Ashford was a reminder of the life they had given up. Every familiar tradition they missed was another small grief to carry alongside their public duties. But there had been unexpected joys as well. The Valdorian people, while slow to warm to their foreign rulers, had begun to show genuine appreciation for Alexander and Catherine's efforts to learn their language and customs. When Catherine had insisted on visiting the families affected by a recent mining accident, speaking with widows and orphans in their own tongue despite her imperfect grammar, the gesture had been reported in newspapers across the kingdom with surprising warmth. Alexander's decision to maintain most of the late King Ferdinand's policies while gradually introducing reforms had earned grudging respect from Parliament. He had avoided the trap of trying to change everything at once, instead proving his competence through careful attention to the kingdom's existing problems. Prime Minister Rodriguez requested another meeting about the trade negotiations with the Eastern kingdoms, Alexander said, switching to the practical matters that filled most of their conversations now. "He's finally stopped looking at me like I'm about to steal the palace silver and flee back to Ashford," Catherine laughed, a sound that had become more frequent as the months passed and they found their footing in their new roles. "High praise indeed. I think he might actually be starting to like us." "Like might be too strong a word," Alexander replied with a wry smile, "but I think he's beginning to believe we're competent enough not to accidentally destroy the kingdom." As evening fell and they called the children inside for dinner, Catherine reflected on how different their family life had become. The formal dining room where they now ate each evening was twice the size of their intimate family space in Ashford, decorated with portraits of Valdorian royalty, who seemed to watch their every move with ancestral judgment. But slowly, carefully, they were making the space their own. Emma had convinced the staff to let her arrange flowers on the table each day, bringing touches of color and life to the formal setting. James had started a tradition of sharing one interesting fact he'd learned about Valdoria each evening, helping the whole family understand their new kingdom better. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine found a letter waiting on her dressing table that made her heart skip. The handwriting was Margaret's, her dearest friend and former lady-in-waiting who had remained in Ashford. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope to find not just a letter, but several small sketches Margaret had made of familiar palace scenes. "My dearest Catherine," the letter began, "I hope this finds you all well and settling into your new life. I thought you might like to see how spring looks in the gardens this year. The roses you planted by the east wall are blooming magnificently, and I swear they smell even sweeter than usual, as if they're trying to send their fragrance across the sea to you." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she studied Margaret's careful drawings of the Ashford Palace gardens, the library where she used to read on quiet afternoons, and the nursery where her children had taken their first steps. Each sketch was labeled with little notes about changes and news. Cook's new assistant, the robin's nest in the usual spot, your favorite reading chair. Still waiting. Alexander found her there an hour later, surrounded by papers and sketches spread across their bed like pieces of a puzzle, showing a life they could no longer live. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her and looked at the drawings of home, his own eyes growing misty as he recognized each beloved detail. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Catherine asked, the question that haunted both of them during quiet moments. "I think we made the only choice we could live with," Alexander replied carefully. "Whether it was right, I suppose history will judge that. But I know Ferdinand and Isabella would have done the same for us, and I know our children will grow up understanding that duty sometimes requires great sacrifice. Will they forgive us for taking them away from everything familiar? I think they already have, Alexander said, gesturing toward the children's rooms where James and Emma slept peacefully in beds that had once belonged to Valdorian princes and princesses. They're stronger than we were at their age, more adaptable. They see this as an adventure and a responsibility, not a loss. As Catherine carefully gathered up Margaret's drawings and placed them in the wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions from Ashford, she realized that grief and duty could coexist with purpose and even happiness. They would always carry the ache of what they had left behind. But they were building something meaningful in Valdoria, creating a bridge between two kingdoms that might prevent future tragedies. 6 months later, when the first anniversary of King Ferdinand's death arrived, Alexander and Catherine stood with their children before the Valdorian people to honor the fallen royal family. But this time, when they spoke to the crowd, they were no longer strangers offering empty promises. They were rulers who had proven their commitment through months of patient service, and the applause that greeted their words carried genuine warmth. They had learned that home isn't always a place you're born to. Sometimes it's a responsibility you grow into, a people you serve and a duty you choose to embrace even when the cost is everything you thought you couldn't live without. In losing their first kingdom, they had found their true calling, and in saying goodbye to one family, they had learned to love another.